Please leave a message. After the Earth. A short story by P.J. Redelskew. Chapter 1. Quinn sat in the dark of the Tangleray, listening as a voice from the future told him Earth was already over. Not in the screaming fireball asteroid impact sense, not a gradual fade into uninhabitable, choking atmosphere, but over, finished, archived. The message wasn't a warning, or a plea, or even a lament. It was, bafflingly, a notification, a cosmic post-delivery confirmation. The Tangleray was a skeletal cathedral of obsolescence, a rusted forest of parabolic dishes reaching toward a sky that hadn't held anything genuinely new in decades. Once it had been a hub for interstellar communication, a hopeful ear pressed against the void. Now it was a haven for squatters, dreamers, and Quinn, a failed poet with a penchant for picking at the static of forgotten frequencies. He preferred the company of echoes to people, the predictability of decay to the volatile churn of modern life. The message had arrived, not as a grand pulsating signal, but as a sliver of noise, a fractured monotone buried in the background radiation. It took him 3 weeks, fueled by lukewarm synth coffee and the stubborn refusal to abandon a hunch, to isolate it, to untangle it from the cosmic hum. It sounded clean, too clean, as if generated not through space, but from a place beyond it. Archive complete. Designation, Earth. Data integrity, 99.997%. Playback initiated. Repeat cycle, indefinite. The voice was genderless, devoid of inflection, a dispassionate recitation of bureaucratic finality. It wasn't about Earth's end. It stated it as a fact already settled, a process already completed. Quinn replayed the fragment, the words etching themselves onto the damp concrete floor of the control room. The message was short, barely 30 seconds, but it carried the weight of millennia. Not the weight of tragedy, exactly, but the chilling lightness of acceptance. Earth wasn't destroyed, it was compressed. Reduced to a single terabyte of data? Impossible. The sheer volume of lived experience, the swirling chaos of history, the infinite nuances of a single human life. To distill it all into something that could fit on a data chip felt like a monstrous act of reduction. He ran a diagnostic sweep, checking for interference, signal degradation, anything that could explain the anomaly. The equipment, salvaged from decommissioned orbital stations in black market tech bazaars, rattled and whined in protest, but the results were conclusive. The message was real. The source was unchartable. It didn't originate from any known star system, or nebula, or dimension. It simply was. Outside, the wind howled through the skeletal remains of the antennae, a mournful dirge for a planet that already existed only as a ghost in the machine. He remembered a history lesson from his childhood, a pre-collapse text about a number significant to early humans, 422. It had denoted a specific cycle, a point of transition. He couldn't place the reason, but the number resonated with the stark finality of the message. A cycle complete. The Earth's. He switched on the array's holoprojector, illuminating the control room with a flickering mosaic of star charts and schematics. The holo display shimmered with greens and blues, attempting to locate the transmission's origin. Nothing. It wasn't a pinpoint source, but a diffuse field, as if the message wasn't sent from a specific location, but emanated from the archive itself, a feedback loop of the past echoing into the present. He ran simulations, calculating the data compression rate, even with the most advanced algorithms, reducing the entirety of Earth's existence to a single terabyte seemed mathematically impossible. Yet, the message didn't lie. It wasn't a garbled transmission or a trick of the sensors. It was efficient, perfect, terrifyingly so. He leaned back in his chipped plastic chair, the cold metal pressing into his spine. What did it mean? Not the end of the world, but the end of originality. An infinite loop of echoes, a flawless replica playing out the same history again and again. He, Quinlan Coda, a failed poet who scribbled verses about the futility of existence, was now listening to a final, cosmic confirmation that his pessimism was in fact tragically accurate. He replayed the message one last time, the dispassionate voice cutting through the silence. Archive complete. Playback initiated. He felt a strange detachment, a sense of being a mere observer in a play that had already concluded. The earth wasn't dying, it was being preserved. And in that preservation, he suspected, lay a far more profound and unsettling loss than any apocalypse could deliver. Chapter 2. Coffee steamed in cracked mugs at the last Echo Cafe, while Quinn argued with Vireo about how a single terabyte could hold every breath and heartbreak of Earth. The cafe, more a collection of salvaged booths and mismatched chairs than a cohesive establishment, smelled perpetually of burnt sugar and old memories. Light filtered softly through the grime-coated windows, highlighting the worn surfaces and slightly crooked portraits of long-forgotten local figures. "Saint's not just information, Vireo," Quinn insisted, tracing the rim of his mug with a calloused finger. Its texture, the precise shade of a sunset over the Aegean, the scent of rain on dry earth, the infinitesimal variations in a lover's voice. You can't quantify that, reduce it to ones and zeros. Vireo, a man whose life appeared entirely devoted to the excavation of minutiae, adjusted his spectacles and regarded Quinn with a patient, almost pitying expression. He'd arrived at the cafe, predictably, summoned by one of the few coded messages Quinn dared send out after decoding the voicemail. "You're thinking linearly, Quinn, too attached to the analogue. Consider this. Even the most rudimentary procedural generation, a simple galactic simulator, for instance, can produce worlds with breathtaking complexity from a shockingly small dataset. Think of the early gaming consoles. Limited processing power, tiny storage, yet capable of crafting entire universes." Quinn scoffed. "A simulation isn't the same as reality. It's a pale imitation, a cleverly constructed illusion. But the principles are the same," Vireo countered, spreading a napkin covered in cramped handwriting across the table. It detailed a complex series of algorithms and fractal equations. Redundancy, compression, pattern recognition, nature itself operates on these principles. Look at DNA, billions of years of evolutionary history encoded in a double helix that could, theoretically, fit in the palm of your hand. The archive isn't storing everything, Quinn. It's storing the rules by which everything operated. He tapped a line on the napkin. Imagine a program that doesn't store every leaf on every tree, but stores the parameters for leaf generation, size, shape, colour, wind resistance. From those parameters, an infinite variety of leaves can be rendered. Quinn leaned back, skepticism etched onto his face. So, they just boiled down the entire history of Earth to a set of instructions? Essentially, yes. And consider this anomaly, this rather peculiar detail. The initial data signature indicated a repeating numeral sequence, 422. It appears intermittently throughout the transmission, a constant undercurrent to the primary data stream. It's not random, it's intentional. I've cross-referenced it with every known historical archive, technological database, and cosmological model. Nothing. Utterly inexplicable. The mention of the repeating numeral sent a peculiar shiver down Quinn's spine. He'd noticed it too, a subtle irregularity in the signal at the Tangle Array, but he'd dismissed it as static, a quirk of the transmission. What do you think it means? Vireo shrugged, his gaze drifting towards the cafe's perpetually flickering neon sign. Perhaps it's an encoding key, a marker for a specific subset of data, or simply a signature, a boast almost. We've archived everything, and also 422. It's maddeningly ambiguous. Or a mistake, Quinn mumbled, tracing a worn patch on the table with his fingertip. Some sort of data corruption, a glitch in the system. Possible, Vireo conceded, but the signal is too clean, too precise for random error. No, this is deliberate, and that's what's truly unsettling. It suggests a level of sophistication, of control, that I find deeply unnerving. He paused, stirring his lukewarm coffee with a plastic spoon. Think about it, Quinn. They didn't just preserve Earth, they reconstructed it, reduced it to its fundamental components, and rebuilt it within a digital framework. What does that say about our existence? Are we merely complex algorithms ourselves? Quinn didn't answer. The thought, once a fleeting philosophical curiosity, now felt like a heavy weight pressing down on his chest. He glanced around the deserted cafe, at the faded photographs and battered furniture, and wondered if this, too, would eventually be reduced to a set of parameters, a digital echo in the vast emptiness of the archive. The precise shade of burnt sugar, the scent of regret, the infinitesimal variations in a forgotten sigh, all reduced to nothing more than 422. Chapter 3. The journey to the memory well had begun as a desperate search for answers. After decoding the anomaly in the transmission, the repeating 422, Quinn was convinced it wasn't just a quirk of the archive, but a hidden key buried deep within its structure. Poppy had been the one to suggest the well, an ancient site rumoured to hold the oldest fragments of the archive's consciousness. So they descended, moving through the derelict husks of old Earth's forgotten cities. Quinn had followed Poppy's lead down crumbling stairwells and through labyrinthine tunnels lit only by the flickering glow of their hand lamps. Poppy moved with the confidence of someone who knew exactly where she was going. Her fingers tracing the cracked walls for subtle glyphs she claimed were as old as the archive itself. At first, the path had felt almost ceremonial. Echoes of ritual etched into the worn stone, the air growing colder and denser with each step. But as they descended, the stillness became something else. A tangible weight pressed in from all sides, a suffocating sense of ancient purpose that neither of them could name. Finally, after hours of silence punctuated only by their own breathing, they emerged into the memory well itself. The air shimmered with static luminescence, and the walls of the cavern pulsed like a living thing. It was here, at the end of their long descent, that Quinn understood. This place had always been waiting for them. Water pooled in the memory well, reflecting broken memories of oceans that no longer existed. Not actual water, of course, more a viscous, luminescent fluid. Residual energy solidified, as Poppy Luxon explained with a grin that didn't quite reach her eyes. Poppy, an archivist turned scavenger with a restless energy and an almost reckless curiosity, had made a life out of mapping these enigmatic ruins. The well wasn't a well at all, but a colossal subterranean chamber carved out of some ancient, unidentifiable stone. It hummed, a low thrum that resonated not in the ears, but somewhere deeper, in the chest cavity. The air hung thick and metallic, laden with the scent of ozone and dust. It's like looking at ghosts, Quinn murmured, his voice swallowed by the cavernous space. He adjusted the focusing lens of his handheld scanner, attempting to clarify the swirling images that danced across the well's surface. They weren't images, precisely, more like fractured echoes, fleeting impressions of landscapes and events. A towering jungle gave way to a crystalline city, which dissolved into a field of crimson flowers, all happening simultaneously, layered upon one another like palimpsests. Ghosts are sentimental, Poppy retorted, already scaling a precarious stack of fractured monoliths that lined the chamber walls. Graffiti, her her signature swirling glyphs, glowed faintly in the dim light, overlaid upon eroded carvings of creatures Quinn couldn't identify. This isn't about spirits, it's about data decay. The archive is leaking, shedding fragments of itself. We're seeing the remnants of its decompression. Decompression? Quinn echoed, still focused on the scanner. The readability was frustratingly low. Everything felt incomplete. Think of it like a corrupted file, Poppy called down, her voice echoing. When a program crashes, it leaves behind fragments of code, glitches in the system. These are the archive's glitches. The memory well is a place where those fragments coalesce. She pointed to a particularly turbulent swirl of luminescence. There, look! Quinn shifted the scanner's focus. The swirl resolved into a fleeting, distorted image of a library. Bookshelves stretched into infinity, filled with indistinct volumes. For a moment the image held, clear and sharp, then fractured again, dissolving into a chaotic mess of light. It's almost like it's trying to tell a story, Quinn mused, his brow furrowed in concentration, but the story keeps getting interrupted. It is telling a story, Poppy corrected. It's telling a million stories all at once. The archive isn't preserving a single timeline. It's preserving the possibility of timelines. Every decision, every branching path exists here as a potential reality. The well is where those potentials bleed together. Suddenly, the scanner's display flickered erratically. A string of numbers flashed across the screen, a repeating sequence that made Quinn's pulse quicken. 422, 422, 422. He quickly cross-referenced the sequence with his datapad. It's the anomaly again. Viria was right, it's everywhere. The signature, Poppy breathed, dropping lightly from the monolith. The archive's fingerprint. But why? Quinn asked, running a hand through his hair. What does it mean? Maybe it's not meant to be understood, Poppy said, tilting her head. Maybe it's just a marker, a way of saying, I was here, or maybe it's a key. She gestured to a section of the well's wall covered in a web of pulsating light. Look closely. The 422 sequence is woven into the fabric of this energy. It's not just in the data, it is the data. As Quinn examined the wall, he noticed something peculiar. The 422 sequence wasn't just repeating randomly, it was organised, arranged into patterns, forming intricate geometric shapes. The shapes shifted and morphed, revealing, then concealing hidden layers of complexity. It's like a map, he whispered, his voice filled with a growing sense of unease. A map of what? Of everything, Poppy replied, her gaze fixed on the pulsating wall. Or perhaps of nothing. The archive doesn't care about meaning, it cares about preservation. The 422 sequence isn't a message, it's a mechanism, a way of ensuring that even in the face of total decay, something remains. The humming within the chamber intensified, vibrating through Quinn's bones. The swirling lights grew brighter, the fractured images more chaotic. He felt a wave of dizziness wash over him, as if the weight of countless forgotten realities was pressing down on his mind. We need to get out of here, he said, his voice strained. I don't think this place is meant for living things. Poppy nodded, a flicker of something akin to fear in her eyes. Agreed, the archive is shedding its skin, and we're caught in the fallout. They turned and hurried towards the chamber's exit, leaving the swirling memories and the cryptic 422 sequence behind. As they walked, Quinn couldn't shake the feeling that they hadn't just observed the archive's decay, they had touched something fundamental, something ancient and unknowable, and that the 422 sequence, whatever it was, held the key to understanding not just the archive itself, but the very nature of existence. Chapter 4. They didn't speak much on the way out. Quinn's mind was already turning over an idea, a tool that might help him find equilibrium amid the chaos. By the time they reached the workshop above the well, he was already pulling salvaged components into a crude assembly, driven by the need to stabilise the anomaly and make sense of the 422. Quinn's hands hovered over the temporal harmonizer, as he called it, knowing that no matter what he did, the past would not change. The device, a precarious assemblage of salvaged oscillators, repurposed data conduits, and components Poppy had cheerfully liberated from defunct orbital stations, resembled less a scientific instrument and more a desperate plea hammered together from flotsam. He'd envisioned it smoothing the jagged edges between present and archive, achieving some resonance, a way to feel the weight of Earth's past without being swallowed whole. Instead, it shuddered with a low, guttural thrum, radiating a coldness that seeped into his bones. The memory well hadn't relinquished its grip. Even back in the makeshift workshop, a cavern carved into the hillside above the well, smelling of damp stone and ozone, the residual energy prickled at his skin. The image of the repeating 422, painted onto the crumbling walls as though by static electricity, swam behind his eyelids. It wasn't a signal, Virio had insisted, but a constant, a fundamental rhythm buried within the archive's compression algorithms, the scaffolding upon which entire epochs were built from a single terabyte. Poppy, sprawled amidst a tangle of cables and half-disassembled circuitry, sketched onto a salvaged metal plate. Her strokes were swift, fluid, capturing the chaotic energy of the well, not as a literal representation, but as a feeling. "You're trying to force a connection, Quinn," she said, not looking up. "Like trying to staple water. The archive isn't waiting to be understood. It is. It just exists." He ran a diagnostic on the harmonizer. The readings were unstable. Oscillations spiked erratically, then flatlined, then surged again. The machine was attempting to map the archive's internal structure, it seemed, and failing spectacularly. "I'm trying to find a point of equilibrium," he mumbled, the words swallowed by the machine's increasing drone. "A way to reconcile the data with everything." "Reconcile?" Poppy finally looked up, laughter curling at the corners of her lips. "You think the universe cares about reconciliation? It's a demolition derby, Quinn, and we're just watching the wreckage." The air thickened. A metallic tang, stronger now, filled his nostrils. The workshop lights flickered, throwing long, distorted shadows. He checked the harmonizer's power regulators. They were functioning within acceptable parameters. The fluctuation wasn't electrical, it was structural, as if the very fabric of the workshop was trembling. "There's something happening," he said, his voice strained. Then the numbers began to manifest. Not on the walls this time, but within the workshop itself, etched onto the rough-hewn stone floor, shimmering into existence on the surfaces of tools and discarded circuitry. 422, repeating, multiplying, layering upon each other until the entire space throbbed with their presence. "The anomaly," Poppy breathed, rising to her feet. "It's spreading." Quinn frantically adjusted the harmonizer's frequency, attempting to dampen the effect. The machine responded by emitting a high-pitched whine that burrowed into his skull, forcing him to clap his hands over his ears. The resonance amplified, and the numbers weren't static anymore. They flowed, dissolving and reforming, tracing patterns that seemed familiar. He recognized them now. Geological surveys of old Earth, depictions of migratory patterns, the logarithmic spirals of ancient shells, the harmonic frequencies of whale song. The anomaly wasn't simply displaying the data, it was distilling it, reducing it to its fundamental components. This wasn't about history, he realized, or even about compression. It was about reduction. The universe, or at least the archive, was stripping everything down to its essential form. "It's not stabilizing, it's decomposing," Poppy said, her voice laced with urgency. "The well is bleeding into this space. We need to get out, Quinn." He ignored her, fixated on the shifting patterns. The 422 wasn't a constant, he realized with a sickening jolt. It was a limit, a threshold. The archive wasn't preserving information, it was discarding everything that didn't fit within its parameters. It was pruning away the complexities, the nuances, the very soul of existence. The workshop buckled. Dust rained down from the ceiling, cracks spiderwebbed across the stone walls. He glanced at Poppy, her face pale with fear. "It's too late," he whispered, the words lost in the rising crescendo of the harmonizer's drone. "It's already happening." They didn't look back as they fled the workshop's collapse. Outside, the world was eerie, quiet, no birdsong, no wind, just the electric hush of something unravelling. In the dark, Quinn tuned the harmonizer's emergency frequency, hoping for a fragment of guidance. Instead, he heard a voice he recognised, Dr. Calix Brome. Brome had once been a cultural theorist and media strategist, a master of turning memory into myth. The last Echo Cafe, where Quinn and Vireo had once debated the archive's meaning over stale coffee and half-truths, had always been a refuge for those who valued memory over noise. Now, Brome had claimed it as the stage for his Remembrance Initiative, the place he'd chosen to sell Earth's final memory as a brand. Poppy listened in silence as Brome's words crackled through the static. "He's not just presenting the archive," she said, her voice tight. "He's turning that quiet sanctuary into a showroom." Quinn clenched his jaw. He didn't trust Brome, never had. But if there was any chance the man understood the 422 anomaly or how to stop the archive's collapse, he needed to hear it. They set off through the deserted streets, the familiar glow of the cafe now a twisted beacon in the night. Chapter 5. Dr. Calix Brome's voice echoed off the cafe walls, promising that Earth's brand would outlive every extinction. The last Echo Cafe, normally a sepia-toned haven of stale coffee and forgotten conversations, now throbbed with a manufactured energy. Holographic projections, shimmering, idealised landscapes of Earth, looped endlessly above each table, meticulously curated to showcase planetary assets. Brome, resplendent in a tailored jumpsuit that shifted colour with his pronouncements, had seized control of the cafe's broadcast system, transforming the unassuming diner into the nerve centre of his global Remembrance Initiative. Quinn and Coda sat hunched in a booth, nursing a lukewarm beverage, the faded ceramic a stark contrast to the polished spectacle unfolding around him. Brome hadn't simply interpreted the voicemail, he'd weaponized it. Each carefully chosen segment of the archival transmission was now a marketing jingle, a promotional tool for a future that wasn't about preservation, but about branding. "The archive isn't a tomb, my friends," Brome boomed, his amplified voice resonating through the cafe. "It's a legacy, a proof of concept. Earth wasn't lost, it was upgraded. Think of it, a perfect, lossless copy, endlessly renewable. We are not mourning a planet, we are celebrating a franchise." The crowd, a bizarre mix of devoted followers and opportunistic investors, cheered. Poppy Luxon, perched on the edge of the booth opposite Quinn, scowled. "Franchise? He's treating a dead world like a limited edition collectible." "It's worse than that," Quinn murmured, his gaze fixed on a projection of the pristine Amazon rainforest. "He's actively filtering the message. He's presenting a sanitized version, removing all the mess, the failure, the reality of it." Brome had identified 422, the limit Quinn had discovered within the archive's compression scheme, not as a point of loss, but as a feature. 422 represents efficiency, he proclaimed. It's the distillation of Earth's essence, the shedding of unnecessary data to achieve optimal playback. This isn't about what was lost, but what was saved. Vireo Lark stood near the counter, his historian's instinct warring with the relentless, upbeat messaging. He'd been attempting to engage Brome in a reasoned debate, but his arguments were swallowed by the manufactured enthusiasm. "He's reducing centuries of cultural nuance to a handful of marketable tropes," Vireo lamented, his voice barely audible. "The archive isn't comprehensive, it's a highlight reel designed to generate revenue." The cafe felt wrong. A strange distortion rippled through the air, mirroring the instability that had consumed Quinn's workshop. Faint particles floated in the holographic light, coalescing into fleeting images, glitches of the memory well bleeding through the structured reality Brom had constructed. The carefully curated landscapes flickered, momentarily replaced by fleeting glimpses of the archive's raw, fractured data. "Notice how the projections are faltering?" Poppy observed, her brow furrowed. "It's like the archive is rejecting the simplification. It's pushing back against the branding." Quinn realised with a mounting sense of dread that Brom's attempt to control the message was accelerating the decay. The archive wasn't meant to be viewed, packaged and sold. It was a complex, fragile system, and Brom's manipulations were unravelling it. He wasn't just building a brand, he was accelerating the erasure of everything that had ever been. Brom, oblivious to the subtle chaos unfolding around him, was unveiling his master plan, Project Rebirth. Using advanced neural interfaces, he intended to allow individuals to experience the archived Earth, immersing themselves in a curated simulation of paradise. "Imagine," he declared, his voice reaching a fever pitch, "a world without suffering, without conflict, without loss. A perfect echo of everything that once was, available on demand." A wave of nausea washed over Quinn. He understood now. Brom wasn't interested in remembering Earth. He was interested in replacing it. He didn't want to preserve the past. He wanted to create a sanitized, marketable future built on its ruins. The holographic projections stuttered violently, then collapsed, plunging the cafe into momentary darkness. A collective gasp rose from the crowd. When the lights flickered back on, the cafe was subtly different. The walls seemed to breathe, the furniture distorted, and the air thrummed with an unsettling energy. The carefully constructed reality was crumbling, revealing glimpses of the archived Earth, not the idyllic paradise Brom promised, but a fractured, fragmented landscape of loss and decay. Quinn, rising to his feet, felt a strange sense of liberation. Brom's control was slipping. The archive was fighting back, and perhaps, just perhaps, there was still a chance to salvage something from the wreckage. Chapter 6. Throughout Brom's performance in the cafe, the archive's data had been played and replayed, compressed recordings of Earth's past presented as seamless illusions. Each holographic projection had been a playback of that stored data, Earth's memory stripped of its messiness, reshaped to fit Brom's narrative. Now, as the final projection stuttered and the illusions fell away, Quinn realised there were no more curated fragments left. In the crumbling light and static, he heard the archive's final voice, a raw, unfiltered echo that wasn't another playback, but the archive itself, speaking beyond Brom's control. In the final playback of the archive's compressed memories, Quinn heard a voice that didn't beg for rescue. It just said, "We remember, even if you forget." It wasn't broadcast, not exactly. It felt seeded within the static, woven into the glitching luminescence of the last Echo Cafe. The cafe wasn't just flickering now, it was dissolving, not into darkness, but into layers of itself, spectral tables overlapping faded booths, the weathered counter replicating endlessly, each version slightly off-kilter, like a distorted photograph. Dr. Brom, stripped of his amplified rhetoric by the archive's stubborn refusal to cooperate, resembled a man unravelling. The neural interface, once a beacon of his Project Rebirth, now pulsed with erratic, useless light. He clawed at the controls, issuing commands that were swallowed by a rising chorus of digital sighs. His obsession hadn't been about preservation, Quinn realised, but about ownership, about having a flawless replica to manage, to shape, to become immortal through. The archive, in its silent defiance, was refusing to be controlled, refusing to be another trophy in Brom's imagined collection. Poppy, leaning against the crumbling doorway, sketched furiously on a scrap of salvaged synth paper. The cafe's disintegration wasn't frightening to her, it was material. She wasn't trying to fix anything. She was documenting the decay, capturing the beauty of its unravelling. "It's like watching a sandcastle return to the beach," she observed, her voice calm amidst the internal chaos. Everything eventually flows back to where it began. Vireo, normally a meticulous chronicler of minutiae, was slumped at a table, his head in his hands. The archive's glitches weren't just ruining his research, they were exposing the inherent falsehood of his approach. He'd chased authenticity, believing he could reconstruct the past with perfect accuracy. Now, confronted with this fluid, dissolving reality, he understood that memory wasn't a fixed point, but a shimmering, subjective echo. 422, he muttered, barely above a whisper. It wasn't about efficiency, was it? It was about what gets lost in the compression. All the subtle nuances, the small, imperfect moments. They're the first to go. The cafe's luminescence intensified, then fractured. Patches of the simulated Earth began to bleed through, a fleeting glimpse of a sun-drenched forest, the murmur of a bustling city street, the vast, cold emptiness of space. These weren't projections, but fragmented memories, uncontrolled and raw. The archive wasn't simply resisting Bron's narrative, it was overflowing with everything it had contained. The beautiful, the terrible, the mundane, the forgotten, all colliding in a chaotic, breathtaking display. Quinn didn't try to make sense of it. He didn't attempt to salvage the fragments, to piece together a coherent picture. He simply allowed it to happen, letting the dissolving reality wash over him. The weight that had been pressing on him for days, the need to understand, to fix things, lifted. He recognized a profound peace in the unraveling, an acceptance of the inevitable. Memory wasn't about capturing the past perfectly, it was about acknowledging its impermanence. He looked at the dissolving cafe, the spectral tables, the fading booze, the blurred faces of Bron and Vireo. It was a monument to loss, but also a testament to the beauty of fleeting moments. The archive wasn't failing. It was reminding them that everything, every relationship, every achievement, every memory was destined to fade. And in that fading, there was a strange, quiet liberation. The final message, woven into the static, wasn't a plea for help or a declaration of triumph. It was a simple acknowledgement. It was beautiful. It is gone. The luminescence faded, not into darkness, but into a gentle silver mist. The last Echo Cafe dissolved completely, leaving behind only the quiet hum of the abandoned server room and the faint scent of something lost but not forgotten. Quinn stood in the stillness, breathing in the silence, and for the first time in a long time, he felt truly, profoundly at peace. We hope you've enjoyed this production of PJ Riddlescue's Please Leave a Message After the Earth. If you enjoyed this production, please consider leaving a thumbs up, and don't forget to subscribe to this channel.